She brought him coffee every morning for 2 years. 2 years of early risings, 2 cups, 2 smiles across a worn wooden counter, and he never once asked himself why. He was too busy surviving to notice that the woman who showed up faithfully every single morning, rain or shine, might be showing up for him. Then one gray morning, she said the words out loud, and he said nothing. The next morning, she didn't come, and the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have said. If you've ever let something good walk out of your life before you recognized what it was, this story is for you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way you think it will. The bell above the door had been broken for 3 months. It still rang, technically. There was still a sound when customers pushed through the entrance of Pierce Hardware on Carver Street, a thin metallic scratch that passed for a chime if you weren't paying close attention. Landon Pierce had been telling himself he'd fix it since September. It was now the second week of December, and the bell still sounded like a sick cat clearing its throat, and most mornings, Landon didn't even hear it anymore. He heard other things. The cough of the old radiator in the back corner near the pipe fittings. The particular groan the third floorboard made when someone crossed from the bolt section toward the paint aisle. The way the refrigerator unit, which he used to keep cold drinks and the occasional lunch he forgot to eat, hummed louder on the days when he was already stressed. Or maybe that was just him projecting. His daughter Macy had accused him of projecting once, with the serious face of a 7-year-old who had recently discovered the word in a library book and was applying it everywhere she could. "You're projecting, Daddy," she'd told him when he suggested the neighbor's dog seemed depressed. "The dog's fine," she'd added. "You're the one who looks sad." He'd laughed it off. He was good at that. At 32, Landon Pierce had developed the particular skill of laughing things off before they could land. It was a survival mechanism more than a personality trait. In the 4 years since his father had died, 4 years since the heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon when Gerald Pierce was 61 years old and supposedly healthy, Landon had been running on something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite despair. It was the narrow, unremarkable road in between. He paid the bills. He raised his daughter. He opened the store at 7 and closed it at 6, Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday he took Macy to the farmer's market because she liked the kettle corn and he liked having somewhere to walk. That was his life. It wasn't a bad life. He was careful about telling himself that because he'd seen bad lives up close. His buddy, Travis, who spent 3 years drowning after his divorce. His cousin Renee, who worked 2 jobs and barely made rent. Compared to bad, Landon's life was fine. The store was hanging on. Macy was healthy and bright and occasionally brutal in the way that only children could be. He had his father's tools, his father's building, his father's name painted in faded letters above the door, Pierce Hardware, Isishin, 1987. What he didn't have, and had convinced himself he didn't need, was anything else. He'd had a marriage once, briefly. Macy's mother, Denise, had left when Macy was 18 months old, not because she was a bad person, but because she was a person who'd wanted something Landon couldn't figure out how to give her, and by the time he understood what it was, she'd already moved to Portland and started over. They were civil now. Macy spent summers with her. It worked, the way detached and efficient things worked, without joy, without pain, without much texture at all. After Denise, Landon had decided, quietly, privately, in the way men decide things they don't say out loud, that he was done. Not dramatically done. Not bitter done. Just done. The math was simple. He had a child. He had a failing business he couldn't bring himself to close because his father's name was on the sign. He had no money to spare and no emotional bandwidth to risk. Love, or whatever people called that particular variety of chaos, was a luxury item. He wasn't in the market. He'd repeated that to himself so many times over the years that he'd stopped noticing it was a decision and started experiencing it as a fact of his nature, like being right-handed or preferring black coffee. He was not a man who made room for love. This was what he believed on the morning of December 12th, a Wednesday, when Aurora Sterling pushed open the door of Pierce Hardware at 7:14 a.m. and the broken bell made its miserable sound and she came in out of the rain carrying 2 coffees, the same way she had carried 2 coffees every morning for the last 2 years. She stomped her feet on the mat inside the door, a habit, not vanity, and shook water from her umbrella before folding it closed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had walked through a great many storms without stopping to complain about them. Her dark coat was damp at the shoulders. Her hair, almost black and cut to just below her jaw, had gone wavy from the weather, which she had never once mentioned and he had never once commented on because it didn't seem to bother her, and anyway, it looked fine. She was objectively a striking woman. Landon was aware of this in the abstract, distant way a person can be aware of a beautiful painting that hangs in a room they pass through every day. Yes, the painting is beautiful, but you've stopped seeing it. You've just started seeing the room. "Rough out there," she said, setting one of the cups on the counter in front of him. Steam curled up from the lid. "Supposed to clear by noon." He picked up the cup. "They said, but they also said last Tuesday would be clear by noon." She settled onto the stool she'd started keeping on her side of the counter. A stool that had technically belonged to the store, but which had, through sheer repetition, become her stool, in the way that certain things become certain people's things without any formal agreement. "They were off by 4 hours," Landon said. "Optimists." She peeled back the tab on her lid. "Or liars. Hard to tell with meteorologists." He almost smiled. Almost. "How's the Whitmore account?" She made a sound that wasn't quite a groan, but was adjacent to one. "Fine. Being made difficult by people who want it to be difficult. You know how it is?" He didn't, entirely. He ran a hardware store, not a consulting firm, but he knew enough about her professional life from 2 years of morning conversations to understand that she worked in some kind of business advisory capacity and that certain people made her work harder than it needed to be, and that she handled them with a composure he found quietly impressive. She never unloaded on him exactly. It was more like she let small observations off the leash and he caught them, and that was enough. What Landon did not know, what almost no one in Millhaven knew, because she had worked for years to make sure of it, was that Aurora Sterling didn't advise companies. She owned them. Not all of them. Not publicly. But through a combination of holding companies, strategic investments, and the kind of patient financial architecture that took a decade to build, she held controlling stakes in 4 of the region's most significant businesses, including the development firm that had quietly purchased 2 blocks of downtown Millhaven 6 years ago and chosen, carefully and deliberately, not to displace the old commercial strip along Carver Street. That particular decision had saved Pierce Hardware without Landon ever knowing it needed saving. She was 30 years old. She had started with nothing except a mind that understood numbers the way musicians understood rhythm, not as facts to be memorized, but as a living language, responsive and intuitive. By 24, she'd made her first million. By 27, she'd structured her holdings so that most people couldn't trace what she owned without a forensic accountant and 6 weeks of patience. She kept an office in Millhaven because she liked the town. She kept visiting Pierce Hardware because she liked the man behind the counter. That second part had crept up on her. She hadn't planned it. It had started as proximity. She'd bought a coffee from the cafe 3 doors down on her first morning in the building, and the cafe owner had mentioned offhand that the hardware store next to next door had the best drip coffee setup in the neighborhood, kept for personal use, but offered freely to whoever came through before 8. She'd wandered in, mostly curious. There'd been a man behind the counter with paint on his sleeve and his daughter asleep in a playpen in the office doorway, the girl small enough that she fit entirely in a nest of folded moving blankets, and the man had offered her coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he'd been expecting her, which he hadn't been. She'd gone back the next day, and the next. 2 years of mornings later, she understood what she felt for him. She wasn't naive about it or confused by it. She had simply chosen, for a long time, not to name it aloud, partly because she valued what they had and didn't want to risk it, and partly because she was terrified of a very specific thing, that he would look at her with the polite, regretful face of a man who genuinely liked her but didn't feel the same way, and that she would have to learn to be in that room anyway because she didn't know how to stop coming. But 2 years was a long time to wait, and December was wearing her patience thin. Macy arrived at 7:40, which was the normal time, delivered by Mrs. Carmichael from next door, who watched her mornings while Landon opened the store. Macy was 7 years old and did not believe in quiet entrances. She barreled through the door. The bell scraped pathetically, shed her backpack onto the floor with a sound like a small avalanche, and wrapped herself around Aurora's waist before her coat was even unzipped. "You're wet," Macy said, stepping back to assess Aurora like a small field inspector. "It's raining," Aurora said. "I know. It's been raining since yesterday. Daddy said it would stop at noon." She turned to Landon. "Did it stop at noon yesterday?" "No." "So he's wrong about noon." "Probably," Aurora agreed. "You should carry a better umbrella," Macy told her, with the serene authority of a child who had just turned 7 and had opinions about most things. "Mrs. Carmichael has an umbrella that's really big. It covers her completely." "I'll look into that. I can come with you." "Macy," Landon said without heat, "she's not shopping for umbrellas." "She could, though." Macy retrieved her backpack from the floor and dragged it toward the office, where she would spend the first hour before school doing something that was nominally homework but was more often a picture book she'd checked out from the library. She was particular about her reading. Landon let her be. "She has strong opinions," Aurora said, watching the girl disappear behind the office door. "Always has." He picked up a shelf-organizing project he'd started before she arrived. Bolts sorted into size, then thread count, then finish, which was how his father had always done it, and how he continued to do it. Not because there was a compelling commercial reason, but because it was the system, and the system was one of the last things that still felt intact. "She's going to be terrifying at 12. "I think she's going to be wonderful at 12. He glanced up. Aurora was watching him in the way she sometimes did, quietly, not quite smiling, something in her expression that he registered and then, as he always did, filed away without examining. He'd taught himself not to examine certain things. It was part of the same skill set as laughing things off. "You're probably right," he said, and looked back at the bolts. They talked about nothing in particular, which was how their mornings usually went, and it was one of the things he valued without ever thinking to name it. The ease. The absence of performance. He didn't have to be on with Aurora, didn't have to project competence or warmth or any particular version of himself. He could just exist, a man in a hardware store sorting bolts, and she could sit on her stool with her coffee and occasionally say something, and neither of them had to fill every silence. And somehow that had become the best part of his day. At 10 to 8, she started gathering herself to go. She did this slowly, in stages, finishing the last of her coffee, folding her umbrella open and closed once to check it, pulling on her gloves. She always seemed to leave reluctantly, which he'd noticed years ago and never thought much about. Today, with her hand on the counter and her coat buttoned, she paused. "Can I ask you something?" He was already sliding a tray of wingnuts toward the right bin. "Sure." "Do you ever think about, She stopped, tried again. "Do you ever get lonely?" He looked up. The question surprised him. Not because it was intrusive. They talked about real things sometimes, but because of the way she asked it, careful, like she'd been holding it back. "Sure," he said. "Sometimes." "Does it bother you?" He thought about it. "I've gotten used to it." She nodded, slowly, like he'd confirmed something she already suspected. Then, "You made a joke last week about me finding someone. Remember? You said some lucky man was going to steal me away one of these days." He did remember. He'd said it offhandedly, meaning it as a kind of compliment. She was smart and interesting, and she should have someone good. "I remember," he said. "Landon." She said his name differently than she usually did, quieter, more careful. "The man I want isn't somewhere out there." The wingnuts were in his hand. He set them down. "Aurora. He's right here." Her voice was steady, but her jaw was set in the way it got when she was pushing through something hard. "He's been here for 2 years. He's standing right in front of me. And I don't know if he's oblivious or scared or just..." She took a breath. "I just needed you to know, because I can't keep coming in here every morning and letting you make jokes about me meeting someone without saying that I have already found someone. I just don't know what he's going to do about it." The store was very quiet. The radiator coughed. Somewhere in the office, Macy turned a page. Landon stood on his side of the counter and felt the ground shift under him. Not in a dramatic way, but the way it sometimes did during structural revelations, when something you thought was solid turned out to have been resting on an assumption you'd never bothered to test. The assumption being that Aurora Sterling came here every morning for the coffee. He opened his mouth. He didn't know what he was going to say. Maybe nothing useful. Maybe something true. But what came out was a silence that started at 2 seconds and stretched to 5 and then to 10, and he watched her face change in that 10 seconds. Watched the steady, controlled expression give way to something that was almost worse than anger. Disappointment. The particular kind that comes from finally risking a thing and having it meet air. She picked up her umbrella. "Okay," she said, and the word was a door closing. "Aurora!" But she was already moving toward the exit. The broken bell scratched as she pushed through. The cold air rushed in, and then the door swung shut, and she was gone. And Landon was left standing in the middle of his hardware store with a handful of wing nuts and the specific sinking feeling of a man who had just let something very important walk out the door and could not, in this moment, get himself to go after it. He stood there for a full minute. Then he put the wing nuts in the wrong bin. He didn't notice until afternoon. The next morning, she didn't come. He told himself he wasn't waiting for her. He told himself this at 7, when he unlocked the front door, at 7:15 when he started his own coffee, at 7:20 when he noticed he'd made 2 cups, at 7:30 when Macy arrived and looked at the counter and looked at him. Where's Aurora? Probably busy. She's never busy in the morning. Today she is. Macy studied him with those dark, unsettling eyes. She had his eyes, people said, but his father's patience. The patience to wait something out and see what it did on its own. Did something happen? No. You're lying. I'm not lying. She has things to do. She always has things to do, and she always comes. He turned toward the bolt section. Macy. Book. Office. She went, but slowly, and with the posture of a child who has recorded the conversation for future use. The store had a particular quality without Aurora in it that Landon struggled to understand. It wasn't that it was louder or quieter. The dimensions didn't change, the inventory remained. The radiator still complained, and the floorboard still groaned, and the broken bell still sounded like suffering every time someone came through. But something was missing from the texture of the morning, the way a room can be fully furnished and still feel empty because one piece of it has been removed. He worked through the morning in a low hum of distraction that he refused to name. Customers came and went. He helped a man named Roy find the right drill bit and spent 20 minutes explaining the difference between concrete anchors and toggle bolts to a first-time homeowner who was slightly out of her depth and appreciated being treated like an adult, capable of learning. He made 3 phone calls. He ate lunch standing at the back counter. He thought about Aurora approximately once every 11 minutes. He counted. Not on purpose. Just noticed. By 3 in the afternoon, he'd replayed the previous morning 11 times in his mind, each time landing on the same sequence. Her voice, carefully even. The man I want isn't somewhere out there. The way she'd looked at him while he said nothing. The door swinging shut. He'd been afraid. That was the honest answer, and he'd spent the better part of this day trying to be honest with himself about it. Not afraid of her exactly. Afraid of the math. Of what it would mean to let someone into his life, into his daughter's life, and have it fail. Macy had already been failed by one departure. He'd been failed by his own. His father had left, not by choice, but the effect was similar. You loved someone, and they became absent, and that absence reorganized everything. The structure of your days, the weight of certain hours. He was tired of reorganizing, so he'd trained himself not to want things he might lose, which was working out brilliantly, he thought, staring at the hardware section of a store that no longer felt like it was just a store, on a morning when the woman who'd made it something more hadn't come. He found her on the 3rd day. Not by accident. Landon Pierce was not a man who waited for accidents to resolve things he'd caused. He'd gotten that from his father, the stubborn, practical notion that problems didn't solve themselves, and men who stood around hoping otherwise were just cowards with excuses. Gerald Pierce had said that once, not to Landon specifically, but to a younger man who'd been complaining about a situation, and Landon had been in the room and the words had stuck in the way certain things did, sideways, unannounced. He'd asked around, casually, not obviously, and found that Aurora kept an office in the Merchant Building on Halliwell Street, which was 3 blocks from the hardware store, and which he'd walked past dozens of times without ever stopping to consider whose space was inside. He went at 4 in the afternoon, which was the latest he could leave Ricky in charge of the store without worrying. He'd told Ricky he had an errand. Ricky was 18 and had worked at Pierce Hardware since last summer and was perfectly capable of handling 30 minutes of foot traffic, but Landon had still written down the location of every common product category on a piece of paper and left it on the counter, which was either responsible or ridiculous and was probably both. The building directory listed her on the 4th floor. He took the stairs. The office was smaller than he'd imagined, not in a disappointing way, just in a human way. A real desk, real papers, 2 chairs, a window that looked out onto the street below where the bare trees were doing what bare trees do in December, which is stand around looking patient. She was on the phone when the receptionist showed him in, and she looked up and something crossed her face. Surprise, then wariness, then something that might have been the beginning of relief but wasn't ready to commit to it. She wrapped up the call in less than a minute. She was good at that, efficient without being curt. Then she looked at him and waited. "I froze," he said. "I know." "That's not—" He stopped, started over. "I should have said something, I know that, but I want to explain what happened in my head because I don't think freezing is the whole story." "Okay?" She folded her hands on the desk. "Not closed off, just careful." "I've spent 4 years talking myself out of things," he said. "Big things, mostly. Things that mattered, because every time I wanted something, the math didn't work out, or the timing was wrong, or something happened that made wanting things feel like a liability." He moved to the chair across from her but didn't sit. He couldn't quite manage sitting. "My dad died, and I had a 7-month-old, and the store was underwater and Denise left, and I found a way to run on empty that felt like it was enough. I got good at enough." She was watching him. Her expression hadn't moved. "And then you showed up," he said. 2 years ago, with 2 coffees, and you just kept showing up. And somewhere in the middle of that, I stopped being able to imagine the morning without you, and somewhere after that, I stopped being able to imagine any of it without you. Macy, the store, the whole thing. You're in it. You're part of it. But I was so busy not wanting things I might lose that I wouldn't let myself see what I already had. A long pause. "So you froze," she said. "I froze." He finally sat, leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and let himself say the thing he'd spent 2 days talking himself into. "I'm scared of this. I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend I'm some guy who's figured everything out, and I'm ready and nothing could go wrong. I'm a single dad running a hardware store on a shoestring, and I don't have a lot to offer you on paper. But He stopped. "You and Macy are the 2 best parts of my life, and I almost let that go because I was afraid of losing it, and I realized that's insane." Aurora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I've noticed about you? Tell me. You always assume you have less to offer than you do." She said it simply, without softness, the way she said true things. "You see the hardware store and the debt and the fact that you're tired. I see the way Macy talks to you. I see the way the customers treat you. I see the way you treated me, like I was a person, not a credential, from the very first morning." She stood, came around the desk, and stopped in front of him. Close enough that he could see the rain still in her hair from 3 days ago, which wasn't possible because she'd brushed it out, but he saw it anyway. "I'm not asking for perfect," she said. "I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking if you want to stop being alone." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Yeah, I do." She didn't throw her arms around him. That wasn't who she was, and they both knew it. She just nodded, the tension releasing from her shoulders in a way that made him understand exactly how long she'd been bracing for the wrong answer. "Okay," she said. "Let's try." The first weeks were imperfect in the ways that real things are imperfect. They were both people with habits carved by years of self-sufficiency, And the architecture of two self-sufficient people trying to occupy the same emotional space without crashing into each other is more complicated than it looks from the outside. There were evenings when he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with her but still came out sideways, too short, too quiet. There were moments when she went distant in a way he didn't know how to read yet, staring at something on her phone with an expression that closed him out without meaning to. They talked about those moments. Not every time. Some things needed to settle on their own, but often enough that the talking became its own habit. One he hadn't had in any relationship before. Macy watched all of it with the patient eyes of a child who had decided something was true and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. The morning routine shifted. Aurora still came at 7:15, still brought 2 coffees, but now sometimes she stayed through Macy's school departure. And sometimes on Saturdays she stayed past noon. And sometimes Landon locked up early enough to walk with them through town in the last gray light of winter. And those walks felt like something he hadn't felt in years. He still worried. He still woke at 3 in the morning with the specific anxiety of a man who has too many responsibilities and too narrow a margin. He still sometimes looked at Aurora and felt the fear. Not of her, but of caring this much about something you could lose. He was learning slowly to keep moving anyway. And every morning at 7:15 the broken bell scratched above the door, and she came in out of whatever weather and set the second cup on the counter, and he stopped pretending he didn't wait for it. He'd been waiting for 2 years. He might as well admit it now. The bell, he told himself, he really would fix. Tomorrow, probably. January came to Millhaven the way it always did, without asking permission, without apology, dragging its gray skies and frozen sidewalks across every surface of the town like it owned the place, which in a certain seasonal sense, it did. The hardware store was never particularly warm in January. The radiator did its best, which wasn't much. Landon had patched the weather stripping around the front door twice in the last month, and it still let in a cold draft that moved along the floor like a low, slow tide, finding the ankles of anyone who stood at the counter long enough. Aurora had started wearing taller boots. She didn't mention the draft. She just adapted, quietly, which Landon noticed and appreciated in the way he was learning to notice things about her he'd spent 2 years not cataloging. She was a person who adapted rather than complained, not out of passivity, but out of a particular kind of practical dignity that he found, the more he understood it, quietly remarkable. She'd grown up with very little, she'd mentioned once, in passing, the way she mentioned most personal history. Briefly, without dwelling. She'd learned early not to wait for circumstances to improve before getting on with things. He thought about that sometimes. How different it was from his own instinct, which was to brace against things, to hold still and weather them. She moved through difficulty the way water moved, finding the available path, not forcing, not stopping. They were learning each other. That was the honest way to say it, not the romantic way, not the version you'd put in a card where we're discovering each other, but the real, unglamorous, frequently awkward process of 2 adults who'd been alone for a long time, gradually figuring out how to account for another person without losing the shape of themselves. It went well most days. It went badly, occasionally. The first real argument happened on a Saturday in the 3rd week of January, and it started, as most real arguments do, over something that was not actually the argument. Landon had promised Macy they'd go to the movies that afternoon, a thing Macy had been tracking on a handwritten calendar she kept on the refrigerator, with the movie circled in red marker and counting down numbers written in smaller and smaller boxes as the days approached. He'd made the promise on a Tuesday. By Friday evening, 3 separate things had gone wrong at the store. A water leak in the storeroom that damaged a section of flooring, a supplier invoice that came in $400 higher than quoted, and a conversation with his bank contact that left him feeling like someone had quietly shifted the ground under his feet. He'd said nothing to Aurora about any of it when she came Friday morning. He didn't know how to say it without it sounding like complaint, and he had a long-standing resistance to sounding like he was asking for anything. Saturday, he woke up at 5:30 and lay in the dark doing the math. The flooring repair alone was going to cost $600. The supplier discrepancy would take 2 weeks to untangle and might not resolve in his favor. The bank. He didn't want to think about the bank. By the time Aurora arrived that morning, not at 7:15 because it was Saturday and she came later, closer to 9, He'd been inside his own head for 4 hours and was in the particular emotional state of a man who has convinced himself he's fine and is therefore very much not fine. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. "I slept fine." She didn't argue. She poured her coffee and sat, and they talked about small things for a while, and then she mentioned, casually, that she'd been thinking about maybe going with them to the movie, if Macy was okay with it. "Of course she's okay with it," Landon said. "She'll love it." "But you're not sure." He looked up. "What?" "You said Macy would love it. You didn't say anything about yourself." It was a precise observation, and that precision caught him wrong. "Aurora, I'm fine. I want you to come." "You seem distracted." "I have a lot going on at the store." "You want to talk about it?" "No." Too fast. He heard it in his own voice as he said it. The door closing before she'd finished knocking. She heard it too. She was quiet for a moment. "Okay." But the word had a texture to it, not anger, something more careful than that. They made it to the movie. Macy sat between them with popcorn in her lap and her attention entirely absorbed by the screen, and Landon sat in the dim theater and could feel the distance he'd created over 4 hours of early morning anxiety sitting between him and Aurora like a third presence. She wasn't cold. She laughed at the right parts. She shared Macy's popcorn when Macy insisted. She was perfectly, exactly fine. But he could feel the slight withdrawal, the polite gap. Afterward, Macy fell asleep in the back seat on the drive home, which was a mercy because it meant the silence in the front didn't have to be explained to anyone. When they got back to the house, Landon carried Macy in and got her to bed and came back out to find Aurora in the kitchen, filling a glass of water like she was killing time. "Say it," he said. She turned around. "Say what?" "Whatever you're not saying." She considered him for a moment, then, "You shut me out today." "I had a rough night. It wasn't about you." "I know it wasn't about me, but you made it feel like I wasn't allowed to be part of it." She set the glass down on the counter. "I'm not asking you to perform happiness. I'm asking you to let me be there when you're not. There's a difference." He opened his mouth, closed it. The defense he'd constructed, "I didn't want to burden you, I was handling it, it wasn't the right time," felt thin under honest examination. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "Do what?" "Let someone be there. When things are bad." He leaned against the doorframe. "Denise always made it worse. Not on purpose, just she didn't know what to do with it, and I didn't know how to explain what I needed, and it would turn into this whole thing, so I learned to just keep it separate. The hard stuff." Aurora was quiet for a moment. "I'm not Denise," she said. "I know that. And I'm not asking you to give me everything all at once. I know that's not who you are." She came around the counter and stopped in front of him, close but not touching. "I'm just telling you that when you shut down, I feel it. And I'd rather know you're struggling than watch you pretend you're not and have to guess what I've done wrong." He looked at her. "You haven't done anything wrong," he said. "It's a leak in the storeroom and a supplier who overbilled me in a bank call I'm not ready to think about clearly." She nodded. "Okay, is it fixable?" "Some of it." "Which parts aren't?" And he told her. Not all of it. He didn't have all of it organized in his own head yet. But enough. The flooring, the invoice, the general, grinding sensation of a business that was viable but barely, that was surviving but not well, that required constant triage and still sometimes bled faster than he could apply pressure. She listened without interrupting, which was not nothing. Most people interrupted. She just let him get through it, and when he stopped, she didn't offer solutions or silver linings or the particular brand of empty reassurance that people deployed when they didn't know what else to do. "That's a lot," she said. "Yeah. It's been a lot for a while." 4 years, he said, give or take. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said carefully, "I want to help. If you'd let me." His first instinct was to say, "I'm fine again," which they both knew by now was the linguistic equivalent of a door lock. He stopped it, made himself think about what she was actually offering. "I don't want you to fix it for me," he said. "That's not what I said." "What did you say?" "I said I want to help. Those are different things." She leaned against the counter beside him. I know people who know suppliers. I know people who know people at banks. I'm not going to come in and take over your store, but I can make some calls if you'll let me. I can ask questions in the right places." He was quiet. "That feels like—" he started, stopped. "I don't want to be the guy who takes from you." "You're not taking anything. I'm offering. It's different when there's—" He gestured vaguely between them. "The relationship. I don't want this to get complicated." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Landon, you've been giving me something for 2 years that you didn't even realize you were giving me." He looked at her. "That counter," she said. "Those mornings. Somewhere I could just be a person, not a title, or a portfolio, or a transaction. Do you understand how rare that is?" He didn't answer. "You don't take from me by letting me make a phone call," she said. "You take from me by pretending you don't need anything, because that's what makes me feel like a guest instead of someone you actually trust." It was the most direct she'd ever been about it. He felt it land, not harshly, but with weight, the specific weight of a truth you've been refusing to turn all the way toward. "Okay," he said finally. "Make the calls." She nodded. No victory in it, just acknowledgement. "And next time," she said, "you don't have to have it figured out before you tell me. You can just say, 'This is bad, and I haven't sorted it yet.' That's enough." "That's harder than it sounds." "I know." A pause. "That's why I'm telling you ahead of time, so you have some practice." He almost laughed. Didn't quite make it, but almost. "You're pretty good at this." "At what?" "Being right without being insufferable about it." She tilted her head. "I've had practice." February arrived, and the town settled into its quieter winter rhythm. The farmers' market moved indoors to the community center, scaled down to a third of its summer size. The school held its winter carnival, and Macy came home with a second-place ribbon in the spelling relay and a detailed grievance against a boy named Owen, who she claimed had cheated, though her account of how he'd cheated shifted slightly each time she told it. "He cheated," she told Aurora for the 4th time, at the kitchen table that had become, without formal announcement, a table where the 3 of them sometimes ate dinner on the weeknights Aurora stayed. "You're sure?" Aurora said, in the tone of someone giving the story space rather than endorsing it. "He definitely cheated." "How do you know?" Macy's brow furrowed. This was always the tricky part of the story. "He spelled necessary so fast. Nobody spells necessary that fast. He definitely practiced." "Isn't that—" Aurora stopped. "That's called studying," Landon said from the stove. "It's called suspicious," Macy said firmly. Aurora looked at Landon's back. He felt her trying not to laugh. He was doing the same thing with the pasta. "Maybe practice something you don't know yet," Aurora said. "For next time." Macy considered this. "I know most things." "What's the longest word you know?" A pause. "Metamorphosis." "That's a good one. What's it mean?" "When something changes into something different, like a caterpillar." "What else changes?" Macy thought about this seriously, the way she thought about most things. "People," she said after a moment. "Mrs. Carmichael said my dad changed a lot after Grandpa died." The kitchen went briefly quiet. Landon kept his eyes on the pasta. "Is that true?" Macy asked him. "Did you change?" "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "How?" He brought the pot to the drain and took a moment with the steam before he answered. "Got quieter, probably. I don't know. Less easy to be around for a while." "But you're easy to be around now," Macy said, with the serene confidence of a child who has not been asked to qualify her statements. He looked over at Aurora, who was looking at her plate with a small, careful expression that was not quite a smile, but was something like it. "Getting there," he said. Spring came in degrees, slowly, and then all at once, the way certain things accumulate. The first real warm weekend arrived in late March, and Millhaven responded to it the way small towns respond to the first warm weekend. Everyone came outside simultaneously, slightly dazed, blinking like they'd forgotten the sun worked this way. The Saturday foot traffic at Pierce Hardware doubled, which was good, because people's instinct upon seeing sunlight was apparently to think about projects they'd been putting off all winter. which meant a run on lumber connectors and deck screws and gallon cans of exterior paint that Landon had quietly restocked in February on a hunch that turned out to be right. Aurora had made 2 phone calls in January. She hadn't told him exactly who she'd called or what she'd said, and he hadn't pressed, partly because he was still practicing the not pressing, and partly because the supplier invoice had resolved in his favor and the storeroom flooring had been repaired by a contractor who charged 40% less than any quote Landon had gotten, and he suspected these outcomes were related to those calls, and that was enough to know. What Aurora had not told him, and what was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid telling him, was the rest. It wasn't a secret she'd planned to keep indefinitely. She'd always understood that at some point the full picture of who she was and what she owned and why she'd moved to Millhaven specifically would need to come into the open between them. She wasn't afraid of that conversation. She was just aware that timing mattered. Landon had enough pride to be hurt by it if he learned it wrong, if it came out sideways through someone else, or at a moment when it would feel like a revelation designed to make him feel small. She was trying to find the right time. The right time was not, as it turned out, the 3rd Saturday of March at 5 in the evening, when Landon's old high school friend and occasional supplier contact, a man named Brett Gallagher, came into the store to pick up an order and stayed to talk and eventually said, with the casual good intentions of a man who had no idea he was detonating anything, "Hey, you know who I ran into at the Regional Business Summit last week? Aurora Sterling. Didn't realize your girlfriend was that Aurora Sterling. Man, those Sterling Holdings deals, that's serious money. I heard she's got a stake in the Carver Street development." The silence that followed was the specific kind that arrives when something true has been said in the wrong room at the wrong time. Landon had his back to Brett when he said it. He was pulling an order from the back shelf. He went still for a moment and then continued pulling the order because he was not a man who let things show in front of other people, but when he turned back around, Brett read something in his face and said, Is that... Okay, I feel like I stepped in something." "No," Landon said. "You're good." Brett left 10 minutes later with a look on his face that was part apology and part retreat. Landon called Aurora. She answered on the second ring. "Brett Gallagher was just in the store," he said. A pause. Brief, but he caught it. "Okay." "He mentioned Sterling Holdings." Another pause, longer this time. "Landon, can you come in?" "Yes. I'm 20 minutes away." He closed early. Not dramatically. He finished the last customer, cashed up, turned the sign, all of it even and methodical. Because when he was upset, the methodical was what kept him from saying something he couldn't take back. He sat behind the counter in the empty store and waited. She came in at 5:45. The broken bell, which he still hadn't fixed, made its thin, insufficient sound. She still carried herself the same way, same coat, same pace, and he had a strange moment of looking at her and seeing both the person he'd come to know and a new outline he hadn't been given yet, and not knowing which version was the true one. She sat on her stool. She didn't try to open with anything soft. "What do you want to know?" she said. "All of it." So she told him. The holdings, the structure, the Carver Street stake. She was clear and specific and didn't dress it up, which he appreciated even through the noise in his head. Sterling Holdings had interests in 4 regional businesses. One of them was the development company that had purchased the block this store sat on 6 years ago. When she'd come to Millhaven, the situation on Carver Street had already been stabilized, a previous decision made for different reasons. But she'd arrived knowing it was her property, knowing the store was on her land. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How long ago did you decide not to tell me?" he said. "I decided to wait until it was the right time. That's not the same as deciding not to tell you." "It feels similar from here." "I know." She held his gaze. "I was afraid you'd see it wrong, that you'd think I came in here knowing who you were and what you needed and that I..." She stopped. "I didn't come here because of the property. I came because the coffee was supposed to be good, and I ended up staying because you made me feel like a person. That order of events matters." "Does it?" "Yes." Quiet, but direct. "Because if I'd wanted to use you for something, I had all the leverage I needed from day one and I never touched it. Not once." He thought about the flooring contractor, the supplier invoice. He thought about 2 years of mornings and what she'd asked for out of all of them, which was nothing. A stool at the counter, a cup of coffee he made, conversation. The calls you made in January, he said. Yes. That was your leverage. That was you pulling strings. That was me helping someone I care about because I knew the right people, and he was too stubborn to ask. A pause. And because the overbilling was real and the contractor quote was legitimate, I just made introductions. I didn't fix anything that wasn't fixable. He pushed off the counter and walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the street. A couple walking a dog. A kid on a bike navigating the last of the winter cracks in the sidewalk. The ordinary evening texture of a town he'd lived in all his life. I don't know what to do with the part where I didn't know, he said. I understand. I feel like I should be angry. You can be angry. I'm not sure I am. He turned back around. I'm not sure what I am. That's the problem. You told me who you are, and I don't know if it changes anything, and I don't know if it should, and I don't know if not knowing that makes me an idiot. She was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, what did you think of me before Brett walked in today? He looked at her. You know what I thought. Say it. A beat. I thought you were the best thing that had happened to me in a long time. That's what I thought. And now? He held her gaze across the store. The radiator muttered. The empty shelves caught the last of the evening light through the window glass. I think you're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time, he said. And I think you should have told me. And I think we're going to have to sit with both of those things. She exhaled, just slightly. The tension that had been in her shoulders since she walked in released, not completely, but enough. I can live with that. I need a day. Okay. Not because I'm done, because I need to think. I know the difference. She stood, picked up her coat. Landon, I'm sorry I let it go too long. I knew it was too long, and I kept telling myself the moment wasn't right, and that's on me. He nodded. She left. The bell scratched. He stood in the empty store for a while, and then he did the only thing that had ever helped when his mind was moving too fast. He started reorganizing the paint aisle, color by color, finish by finish, the way his father had taught him. The physical order of it, the simple logic of things that had right and wrong places, settled something in him that words hadn't quite reached. He thought about what she'd said. I didn't come because of the property. He thought about 2 years of mornings, about the stool, about the coffee she brought for him that he'd spent a year not thinking too hard about. He thought about the way she'd listened in January, not to fix, to be there. He called her at 9:30 that evening. I'm not done being a little bit thrown, he said when she picked up. I know, she said, but I don't want a day. I just wanted to say that. A pause. He could hear her breathing steady on the other end. Okay? Next time something this significant comes up, he said, we're just going to say it, even when it's complicated, even when the timing isn't right. Agreed. Good. He leaned back in his chair. Also, the stool is yours. I want you to know I've decided that formally. Silence. Then, very quietly, are you trying to be funny right now? A little. It's working, she said, and he could hear the smile in it, the way you can hear certain things in a voice you've been listening to long enough. A little. They talked for another hour that night, about nothing urgent. Macy's school project, a roof repair on the back of the building Landon had been postponing, a restaurant in town she wanted to try that he'd been skeptical of on principle because it had opened in a space that used to be a diner he'd liked. The ordinary conversation of two people who are finding their way back to each other after a small earthquake and choosing, deliberately, to keep walking. It wasn't resolved entirely. The shape of what she was, the holdings, the scope of it, the fact that he worked on land she owned, would take time to settle into something he could see clearly without flinching. He was honest with himself about that. But he also knew, with the kind of knowledge that came from 4 years of hard math and 2 years of those mornings, that certain things couldn't be undone. She had become load-bearing in his life without either of them quite planning it. Meiji called her by her first name and meant it like a person who had earned the sound of it. The mornings had structure because she was in them. He was not. He had decided somewhere around the third gallon of antique white he'd put back in the correct spot. A man who was going to let fear make his decisions for him anymore. He'd tried that. It had resulted in a very tidy hardware store and a very empty life. Spring was coming. The light was lasting longer each evening, and the bell above the door, which he really was going to fix one of these days, made its small, imperfect sound every morning at 7:15, and he had started to think of it as something like music. Not perfect music, but his. Spring in Millhaven had a way of making people believe things would be fine. The trees along Carver Street filled back in. The hanging baskets outside the flower shop, 2 doors down from Pierce Hardware, came back with yellow and purple, and the light by 6 in the evening was long and gold in a way that made the whole street look like it was worth something. Landon had propped the front door open on the warm days, which he'd been doing since he was a teenager helping his father on Saturdays, and the smell of cut lumber and machine oil mixing with the outside air was the smell of the store working, which was the smell he'd grown up with and still found, in some fundamental way, reassuring. Things were not fine exactly, but they were better. That was the honest version. The supplier situation had stabilized. The storeroom floor had held through March and into April, without incident. A modest uptick in spring project traffic had given the monthly numbers some breathing room, not enough to stop thinking about the numbers, but enough to stop thinking about them every hour. Macy had finished 2nd grade with a report card that included the teacher's note. Macy is curious, determined, and occasionally argues with me about word definitions. She is usually right. Landon had read that note 3 times and put it on the refrigerator. Aurora came every morning. The stool was hers in every practical sense now. Ricky, who'd started treating her like a fixture the way he treated the radiator and the floorboard, had taken to setting it out for her before she arrived. A small ritual that nobody had asked him to start, but that nobody stopped him from doing either. She and Landon had reached through the winter and the argument and the disclosure that had taken them 2 days to navigate, something that felt more solid than what they'd had before. Less tentative. The kind of thing that gets stronger from being tested, if you're both still standing after the test. It was into this version of things, careful but real, imperfect but intact, that Damian Cross arrived. Landon first noticed him on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of April. He came into the store at 10:30, which was not the usual time for any kind of business. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, dressed in the particular way of men who spend money on clothes, but choose clothes that are supposed to look effortless, which always had the opposite effect. Dark jacket, open collar, shoes that cost more than Landon's monthly utilities. He was not tall, average height, broad in the shoulders, but he carried himself with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that confidence was a performance and had been performing it long enough that it had almost become natural. Almost. He walked the store slowly, not looking at merchandise, looking at the store itself, the dimensions of it, the layout, the ceiling height, the way a person looked at a property rather than a shop. "Can I help you find something?" Landon asked. The man turned, smiled. The smile was practiced too. "Just browsing." "Sure." He browsed for another 5 minutes, touching nothing, and then he left. Landon watched him go through the window and then went back to what he was doing and told himself it was nothing, because most things that felt like something turned out to be nothing, and he'd learned not to spend energy on shadows. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Damian Cross came back on Thursday. This time he came alone and at closing, 5:50, when the last customer had gone and Ricky was straightening the back aisle before heading out. He stood at the counter and waited while Landon finished cashing up, and there was something deliberately theatrical about the waiting, the particular patience of a man who wanted you to know he wasn't in a hurry. "Landon Pierce," he said when Landon looked up. "That's me. Damian Cross." He put a card on the counter. "Cross Capital. You may have heard of us." Landon picked up the card and looked at it. Embossed, heavy stock. He set it back down. "Can't say I have." "No reason you would have." Cross settled against the counter with a casual ease that was designed to seem informal and succeeded mainly at seeming calculated. "We do a lot of work in this region. Property, development, business acquisitions. I've been looking at the Carver Street corridor for some time." "Looking at it for what?" "Investment purposes." A pause. This is a well-positioned property. Landon kept his expression even. This is a hardware store. On a very well-positioned block. Cross smiled again. The development potential on this street is significant. Not immediate. There are some existing arrangements that would need to resolve, but within a reasonable horizon, the upside is considerable. Landon thought about what Aurora had told him in March, about Sterling Holdings, about Carver Street. I rent, he said. You'd want to talk to my landlord. I've already had some preliminary conversations in that direction. A casual wave of his hand, like it was nothing, which meant it was something. But I wanted to speak with you directly, man to man. Landon waited. A business like this, Cross said, his tone shifting slightly, still smooth but with a new note in it, something between sympathy and condescension, has a ceiling. You know that as well as I do. The margins on independent hardware retail are difficult in the current environment. Chain competition, online purchasing, supply chain volatility. You've been keeping your head above water. I respect that. But above water isn't the same as forward. I'm doing all right. You're doing better than most in your position. I'm not dismissing what you've built. He paused. But I'm also not here to waste your time with small talk. I'm here because I have a proposition. I'm listening. Cross reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, which he unfolded and laid on the counter with the ease of a man who had done this move many times. It was a single page with a number at the bottom. A number with enough zeros that Landon stood very still for a moment. That's a buyout figure, Cross said, for the business and goodwill. Inventory valued separately. You'd walk away clean with enough to start over wherever made sense, or not start over at all if you preferred. Landon looked at the number. Then he looked at the man. Walk away from what? He said. The store. To do what? Whatever you wanted. Cross spread his hands. That's the point. You'd have options you don't currently have. Landon folded the paper back up and pushed it across the counter. I'm not selling. A flicker in Cross's expression. Just a fraction, just long enough to show that he'd expected something more negotiable than this. He recovered quickly. I'd encourage you to think about it before responding. I've thought about it. That was about 12 seconds. I'm a fast thinker. Landon met his gaze. This store has my father's name on it. It's been here since 1987. I'm not selling it to fund a development project. Cross picked the paper up and folded it back into his pocket without hurry. All right, he said. I respect the position. He said it in the tone of a man who did not respect the position. Think about it anyway. The offer has a window. He left. Ricky appeared from the back aisle a minute later. He was 17, technically 18 now, and had the lanky, slightly unfinished look of a young man still sorting out what his face was going to do. He'd clearly been listening. Who was that? He said. Trouble, Landon said. Then, go home, Ricky. I'll finish up. He told Aurora that evening. She came over for dinner. She'd started doing that twice a week, usually Tuesdays and Thursdays, a pattern that had emerged organically and that Macy had incorporated into her refrigerator calendar with a small symbol that looked like it was meant to be a coffee cup. Landon had cooked badly. Pasta again, because pasta was reliable, though tonight's sauce had gone over-seasoned. And Macy was in the bath when he told her about Cross Capital and the man with the expensive shoes and the folded paper. Aurora went still. It was a particular kind of still. Not surprised. More like a person who has been waiting for a specific word and just heard it. You know who he is, Landon said. I know of him. She set down her fork. Damian Cross has been trying to acquire certain assets in this region for about 2 years. We've crossed paths in a professional context. What kind of professional context? She was choosing her words carefully, which he noticed. He made an approach to Sterling Holdings about 8 months ago, about the Carver Street property, among other things. My answer was no. And now he's here talking to me. If he can't get the property through the ownership, he'll try to neutralize the anchor tenants. She said it without drama, in the tone of someone describing how a machine worked. If the businesses on the block go under or sell, the property value changes. The ownership position becomes more complicated. Landon was quiet for a moment. So this is about you. It's about the property. I'm connected to the property. A pause. And he knows about us. How? Millhaven is a small town. She looked at him evenly. He would have found out quickly once he started looking at the block. Landon pushed back from the table slightly, not in anger, just needing the space to think. He didn't mention you once. No, he wouldn't. That's a move. Yes. He was quiet again. The bath upstairs went quiet too, which meant Macy was either done or had fallen asleep in it, and he'd need to check in a minute. He looked at Aurora across the table and thought about the number on that folded paper, which had been significant enough that a different version of himself, the version from 4 years ago, the one running on fumes and desperation, might have hesitated. He hadn't hesitated. What does he actually want? Landon said. He wants the block for development. Probably mixed commercial and residential, premium tier. It's a good location for it. She said this without resentment, just accuracy. He has the capital. He doesn't have the property. And he's coming at it through me. He's testing the edges, she said, seeing where it gives. It doesn't give. She looked at him. I know that. He doesn't know that yet. He heard the bath drain upstairs. A minute later, Macy appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, damp hair flattened against her forehead. I'm done, she announced, as if there had been some question. Brush your teeth, Landon said. I know. She disappeared. Then, from the hallway, Aurora, can you come read to me after? Aurora looked at Landon. He nodded. Give me 5 minutes, she called back. In those 5 minutes, they sat with what had just been said, and Landon did the thing he was slowly learning to do, which was to let Aurora be in the problem with him instead of managing it alone in the space behind his eyes. Tell me what I should know, he said. About him. About how this works. She told him. Damian Cross was not a predatory operator in any illegal sense. He was a businessman who moved on weakness and opportunity, who understood that leverage came in many forms and who was patient in his application of it. He didn't break rules. He bent conditions. He worked the margins of situations until the people in them felt like the margin was all that was left. So the offer to buy me out, Landon said, was the first move, the clean one. And if I say no? She hesitated, just slightly. He starts making the business harder, not directly. He'll never touch you directly. But suppliers get calls. Lending relationships get tested. A noise complaint gets filed or a permit review gets flagged. None of it is traceable to him. All of it is uncomfortable. Landon listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, This is going to get worse before it gets better. Probably. You could make it go away. She tilted her head. How do you mean? The property. If you made the ownership clear publicly, the leverage shifts. He said it carefully because he'd thought about it from 3 angles already. Doesn't it? It complicates his position, yes. Why haven't you done that? A pause. Because I was trying to manage it without drawing you into it more than you already were. She held his gaze. That was probably wrong. Yeah, he said, not harshly, just honestly. It was. She accepted this without deflecting. He'd come to appreciate that about her, the way she could take accountability without turning it into a performance of remorse that required him to manage. We do this together, he said, whatever comes next. You might not like some of what comes next. I don't like this already. Might as well keep going. He found out what came next over the following 3 weeks, and she had been right that he wasn't going to like it. It started with Halverson Supply. Halverson was his main supplier for basic hardware inventory, bolts, screws, anchors, the high-turnover commodity items that made up the bread and butter of day-to-day sales. He'd had the same account with them for 4 years, same terms, same rep, a reliable man named Phil who called every second Tuesday and who had once driven 2 hours to deliver an emergency order when Landon's usual shipment got delayed. That relationship had worked because it was straightforward and consistent, and both sides had kept their end of it without drama. On the first Monday of May, Phil called on a Wednesday instead of Tuesday, which was the first small wrong note. Landon, he said, I need to give you a heads up. There's going to be a terms adjustment on your account. What kind of adjustment? Credit terms are moving to net 15 from net 30, effective next cycle. Landon was quiet for a moment. Net 15 meant he had to pay within 15 days of invoice instead of 30. On paper, a small change. In practice, with his current cash flow, it meant he'd be scrambling to cover invoices before the corresponding sales had fully come in. It wasn't fatal, it was pressure. Why? He said. Phil sounded uncomfortable. Portfolio-wide policy review. It's not personal, Landon. Is it a portfolio-wide adjustment, or is it account-specific? A pause that lasted a beat too long. I'm not really able to get into that level of detail. Phil. I'm sorry, Phil said, and he sounded like he actually was. 2 days later, Carver Street Merchant Cooperative, a loose association of the block's business owners that met quarterly and mostly existed to share the cost of holiday decorations and coordinate garbage pickup schedules, got a letter from the city noting that the block's commercial waste management variance was under review and would require a hearing in 6 weeks. The variance had been in place for 11 years. Landon had never heard anyone mention a problem with it. He mentioned it to Aurora. He's moving, she said. How many of these things can he do? More than this. He hasn't started the serious pressure yet. This is, she searched for the word, introductory. Great. Landon, I'm not panicking. He was, a little. He was keeping it below the surface because below the surface was where he kept things. But he was aware that this was one of the habits he was supposed to be working on. I'm thinking. Tell me what you're thinking. He thought for a moment about how to say it. I'm thinking about how much of this I can absorb before it starts affecting Macy's life. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the store. The store I can probably find ways to manage. But if the margins compress enough that we're back to where we were 2 years ago, he stopped. She's 8. She remembers things now. She'll notice. Aurora was quiet in the particular way that meant she was taking something seriously. I'm not going to let it get there, she said. You can't promise that. I can take actions that make it very unlikely. Like what? Like having a direct conversation with certain people about what's happening and making sure the right information is in the right places. She paused. And like being more visible. About us. About the property. Right now he's operating with a lot of informational advantage. That changes if things are out in the open. What does more visible mean? It means not hiding what I own. It means being present on the block in a way that's clear. It means not letting him operate in the space between what people know and what they don't. He thought about it. You'd be giving up the privacy you've spent years building. Yes? That's not nothing. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. Why would you do that? She looked at him steadily. Because you asked what we could do together, not what I could do alone. And this is the part I can contribute. A pause. Also because he doesn't get to use my store's tenant as a pressure point and face no consequence for it. I find that extremely irritating. Despite everything, Landon almost smiled. Extremely. Very. She sat back. But we do this carefully. No panic moves. We understand what he's building before we respond. He nodded. Agreed. They agreed. And for a few days, that felt like enough. Then the bank call came. It wasn't the same contact Landon had been working with since his father's time. That man had retired in the fall. The new contact was a woman named Holloway, professional and efficient, who'd been reasonable and helpful across 3 interactions since taking the account. So when her name showed up on his phone on a Thursday at 4 o'clock, he answered without bracing. He was bracing within 30 seconds. The store's line of credit, a modest business credit facility he'd maintained for 15 years, the same one Gerald Pierce had set up in the store's early days and that Landon had kept current without missing a payment, was being reviewed. The review could result in a reduction of the available limit. The decision would be communicated within 3 weeks. He asked why. It's a standard portfolio assessment, Holloway said. I want to be transparent with you. There are some flags on the commercial real estate situation on your block that have prompted a more thorough look. Flags from who? I'm not able to share that information. He thanked her, hung up, and stood in the middle of the store for a moment. Then he went to the back room, sat down in the old chair his father had kept by the work table, and let himself feel the weight of it without moving. The credit line had been the one thing he hadn't been worried about. It was the floor under everything. If the limit got cut, if the available liquidity shrank, he'd lose the ability to absorb timing gaps between payables and receivables. A slow week in June could cascade into a backorder situation in July. A backorder situation in July could mean empty shelves in August, which was a significant selling season. He sat in his father's chair for a long time. Gerald Pierce had sat in this same chair on bad days. Landon had found him here once, when he was maybe 12, on a day when the store had had a bad month and his father had been quiet all through dinner. He'd sat across from his father in the old spare chair and they'd talked about nothing in particular for an hour. Baseball, mostly, because Gerald Pierce had loved baseball. And at the end of it, his father had said, "You know what keeps this place going, Landon? Not the inventory, not the margins, the people who know you. That's the only thing that actually lasts." He'd been 12. He hadn't entirely understood it. He was 32 now, and starting to. When Ricky poked his head into the back room to say he was heading out, Landon told him to lock the front and take the sign. Then he called Aurora. "He hit the credit line," he said when she answered. A pause. Then, "How bad?" "Review. They might cut the limit. 3 weeks." He heard her exhale slowly. "Okay." "That's not okay." "No, but it's manageable." A pause. "Landon, listen to me. He's escalating because you didn't take the offer. In his experience, this is the point where people start reconsidering." "I'm not reconsidering." "I know. But I need you to understand what's happening. He's not trying to destroy you. He's trying to exhaust you. There's a difference. And the difference matters because exhaustion is what we're fighting, not force." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm tired," he said. Not dramatically, just the truth. "I've been tired for 4 years, and now there's this on top of it." "I know. Tell me honestly." He leaned back in the chair. "Can we actually win this?" She didn't answer immediately. He appreciated that. The pause meant she was being honest rather than reassuring. "Yes," she said, "but not the way you want to win it. Not by outspending him or outmaneuvering him at his own game. He's better resourced for that fight than we are." "Then how?" "By being more rooted than he is." She said it simply. "He's operating like this is a transaction, like you're a variable he can adjust. He hasn't accounted for the fact that you've been in this town your entire life, and your father was here before you." "My father has been dead for 4 years. That doesn't carry much weight in a credit review." "It carries more weight than you think in other rooms." A pause. "Let me make some calls." Aurora, not to fix it, to inform people, to make sure the right people understand what's happening on this block and why. Another pause. "There's a difference between asking for help and making sure your allies know there's a fight." He thought about his father's voice, low and certain in the back room. "The people who know you, that's the only thing that actually lasts." "Make the calls," he said. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure continued in the small, invisible ways that Damian Cross preferred. A health inspection, routine technically, arrived with 5 days' notice and required Landon to spend a full day reorganizing storage that had been fine for years. A second supplier, a regional paint distributor, quietly renegotiated a better deal with a competing shop across town and let Landon's preferred pricing lapse. These were not coordinated in any documentable way. They didn't need to be. A man with Cross's resources and patience didn't need to direct every move. He just needed to apply heat at enough points and let the physics do the work. Landon handled each thing as it arrived. He reorganized the storage. He found a substitute paint distributor at slightly worse margins and adjusted. He went through each week doing the triage that 4 years of running a business on the edge had made him very good at. What he didn't do, and this was different from the way he'd handled hard things before, was handle it alone. Aurora knew about every development. They talked most evenings, sometimes briefly, sometimes for an hour. She didn't manage things for him. She'd understood that that was the wrong shape of help, but she tracked the situation with the precise, unsentimental attention of someone who understood the mechanics involved. She made the calls she'd mentioned, carefully, to the right people. She waited to see what moved. Macy, for her part, knew something was wrong in the way children always knew something was wrong, which was precisely and without the ability to name it. She was quieter at dinner some nights. She drew more. One evening, Landon found a drawing on the kitchen table. The hardware store, recognizable by the sign and the door, with 3 figures standing outside it, one tall, one medium, one small. No caption. He left it on the table. The following Saturday, he was behind the counter sorting through a delivery, the first of the spring's contractor orders, which was a reliable revenue stream if he could keep the commercial accounts. When the door opened and Damian Cross walked in for the 3rd time, he was alone again. Same jacket, same practiced ease. He came to the counter and stood there and waited until Landon looked up. "Mr. Pierce, Mr. Cross." "I wanted to check in." The smile, measured and clean. "I understand there's been some turbulence lately. I hope things are manageable." Landon set down the clipboard in his hand. He kept his voice level. "Things are fine." "Glad to hear it." Cross glanced around the store in the way he had, assessing rather than seeing. "My offer is still open. I want you to know that. The window isn't unlimited, but I'm a patient man." "I appreciate that," Landon said, "but the answer's the same as it was." Cross nodded slowly. "You're a stubborn man. My daughter would agree with you." Something shifted in Cross's expression, very slightly. An adjustment, like a man revising his read of a room. "Your daughter, she's what, 7, 8? That's not your business." A pause. The smile held. "Fair enough." He put both hands on the counter, not threatening, just present. The posture of a man who wanted to seem reasonable right before he said something that wasn't. "Let me be honest with you. The environment around this block is going to change over the next 12 to 18 months. There are economic forces at work that don't stop because one tenant decides to hold. I'm not threatening you. I'm describing a reality. And in that reality, the choices you make now determine whether you end up with capital or without it." Landon looked at him for a long moment. "Let me be honest with you," he said. "I've heard everything you're saying, and I understand the version of this where you're the reasonable businessman explaining market conditions to a stubborn man who doesn't see the full picture." He picked the clipboard back up. "I also understand the version where you're a man who's been running a pressure campaign against my business for a month because I turned down your offer, and you're here to see if I'm scared enough yet." Cross's smile went a fraction thinner. "I'm not scared enough yet," Landon said, "and I won't be. So if the offer has a window, let it close." He looked back at the delivery list. "I've got work to do." Silence. Long enough to be meaningful. Then Cross said very quietly, "That's a shame." He left. Ricky appeared from behind the paint aisle, where Landon was fairly certain he'd been frozen in place for the last 4 minutes. "That guy," Ricky said, "is extremely creepy." "Yeah." "What are we going to do?" Landon looked at the delivery list, at the inventory, at the store his father had built, and the name above the door and the stool by the counter that had been empty all morning. "We're going to keep going," he said. "Get back to work." Ricky went. Landon picked up the phone and sent Aurora a text. He came back. "Same offer." I said no. Her reply came in 40 seconds. "Good. Give me tonight. I have an idea." He put the phone down and went back to the inventory and did the thing he'd been doing for 4 years, which was keep the lights on 1 hour at a time. But he was not, for the first time in a long time, doing it alone. And that, even now, even with the credit review and the supplier adjustments and the patient, invisible pressure of a man with resources he couldn't match, made it different. Not easier, just different. The kind of different that meant you didn't have to calculate the distance to the bottom every time you stumbled, because there was someone beside you who wasn't going anywhere. Outside on Carver Street, the afternoon light was doing its spring thing, warm and long and insistently optimistic. And the baskets outside the flower shop were full of color. And the bell above the door of Pierce Hardware was still broken, still scratching instead of ringing, still making its small, insufficient sound every time someone came or went. He'd been meaning to fix it for months. One more thing on the list. Aurora's idea turned out to be less of a single move and more of a decision. The kind that, once made, changed the shape of everything downstream. She told him about it the following Sunday morning, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee she'd brought because that was still the habit. And the habit was one of the things that had held them together through the last several weeks. Macy was at a friend's house until noon. The apartment above the store was quiet in the specific way it was quiet on the mornings nobody had anywhere to be, and the light came in through the east window and did what Sunday light did, which was make everything look slightly more like it might be okay. "I want to go public with the ownership structure," Aurora said. "Formally. Not through Sterling Holdings. Through me, personally. My name attached to the Carver Street property in a way that's visible and clear." Landon had his coffee in both hands. "What does that actually do?" "It changes the information environment. Right now, Cross is operating in the gap between what people know and what they don't. He knows the block is Sterling Holdings. Most people on this street don't know that Sterling Holdings is me, and they don't know me." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "If I'm a visible presence, as the landlord, as someone who lives in this community and has a stake in it that goes beyond financial, his strategy looks different. He can't quietly apply pressure to tenants on a block that everybody knows belongs to someone who's paying attention." "He'll adjust," Landon said. "He'll find other angles." "Yes, but the angles get harder and more visible." She paused. "There's also the matter of the merchants' meeting." He looked up. "What meeting?" "The cooperative meeting. Quarterly. It's in 3 weeks." She set her cup down. "I want to be there, not as a silent stakeholder, as the landlord. And I want to make an offer to the other tenants, rental terms that are fixed for 5 years, below market, in exchange for their commitment to the block." Landon was quiet for a moment. "That costs you money." "Yes. Significant money if you're locking rates below market for 5 years across the whole block." "Yes." "Why would you do that?" She looked at him steadily. "Because these businesses are what makes the block worth anything in the first place. Cross sees the property value. He doesn't see that the property value comes from the flower shop and the bakery and your store and the shoe repair place that's been there since before either of us was born." She paused. "And because if the block is stable and the tenants are committed and the community understands what's here, his development thesis falls apart. He needs turnover to build his case. I'm going to make turnover structurally difficult." Landon thought about this. About Pete Novak at the shoe repair shop, who'd been on the block for 31 years and whose hands had the look of a man who had repaired 10,000 shoes and intended to repair 10,000 more. About Carmen Reyes at the flower shop, who'd expanded twice in 8 years and whose Saturday arrangements were bought by half the town for every occasion worth marking. About the bakery at the corner, run by the Okafor family, whose bread Macy considered one of life's non-negotiable goods. "Have you talked to any of them?" he said. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." He appreciated that. He sat with it for a moment. "They don't know who you are," he said. "They know you as—" He gestured vaguely. "The woman who comes in for coffee." "I know. That's going to be a conversation." "Yes, it is." She looked at him evenly. "Is it one you can be in with me?" He thought about Pete Novak, who'd known his father, who'd given Landon a handshake and a lecture about credit terms when he'd taken over the store at 28 and hadn't known enough to be offended by the lecture. About Carmen, who sent over flowers for the store's anniversary every year, 2 days after the actual date, because she always forgot and then overcorrected. About the Okafors, who had 3 kids, one in Macy's class, one in high school, one just starting to walk. "Yeah," he said. "I can be in it." The conversation with Pete Novak happened first, on a Tuesday, because Pete was in his shop by 6:30 every morning and left at 4 and didn't answer phone calls he didn't recognize, so if you wanted to talk to Pete, you showed up. Landon went at 7 before he opened the hardware store, and Aurora came with him. Pete was 63, broad-shouldered, with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who worked with his hands, and had learned that rushing things usually meant doing them twice. He had a son in college and a wife who taught elementary school and a shop that smelled permanently of leather and polish and the particular machine oil he used on his sewing equipment. He'd never redecorated. The shop looked now almost exactly as it had looked when his father ran it, which Pete took as a sign of consistency, and which probably also reflected that Pete had better things to spend money on. He looked at Aurora for a long moment when Landon introduced her properly. "Sterling Holdings," he said. "Yes," Aurora said. Pete put down the heel he'd been shaping. Landon's been paying rent to you for 2 years and didn't know it. That's right. Pete looked at Landon. How do you feel about that? I had some feelings about it, Landon said. I've processed them. Pete made a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval, which was more or less his response to most information. He looked back at Aurora. What are you here to tell me? She told him. The situation with Cross Capital, the pressure campaign on the block, the rental offer she was preparing. She was direct and specific and didn't dress any of it up, and Pete listened the way he listened to everything, which was completely, without interrupting, his hands still on the work table. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. My father paid rent on this shop for 22 years, he said. The man he paid it to tried 3 times to double the rate. My father held on by not spending anything he didn't have to spend. He looked at Aurora. What you're describing, the 5-year fixed terms, that's real. It's real. I'll put it in writing. Why? Because I'd rather have Pete Novak in this shop for 5 more years than have a premium residential unit where it used to be. He studied her for another moment. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who looked more like she had something to sell. He picked the heel back up. Send me the paperwork. I'll have my son look at it. He's studying law. That's exactly what you should do. They left Pete's shop and walked 2 doors down to the flower shop, where Carmen Reyes was receiving a morning delivery and managing it with the specific controlled chaos of a person who had received deliveries every morning for 8 years and still found them slightly more than expected. She was 40, quick-moving, with paint-stained fingers that Landon had always assumed were from a hobby she never mentioned and had never asked about. Carmen's reaction was different from Pete's. When Aurora finished the explanation, Carmen put both hands flat on the work table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This explains so much, she said. What does it explain? Landon asked. 3 years ago when my lease came up and the rate didn't change. I thought it was an error. I called the management company 4 times and finally someone told me the rate was intentional. She looked at Aurora. That was you. The rate was fair, Aurora said. It was below fair, and you know it. Carmen shook her head slowly. Why didn't you just tell us? I was trying to keep a low profile. For what reason? It's complicated. Carmen looked at Landon. Is she always like this? Gets better, he said. Carmen exhaled. Then, okay, what do you need from me? They had the same conversation at the bakery with Marcus Okafor and his wife Adayeze, who listened carefully and asked practical questions about the lease terms and what protections the 5-year commitment would include. Marcus was a methodical man who ran a methodical business, and he wanted specifics, which Aurora had ready. Adayeze was quieter but watched Aurora with the attentive, assessing look of a woman who was deciding whether to trust someone and hadn't finished deciding yet. Before they left the bakery, Adayeze said, My daughter knows your daughter. Aurora looked at her. I know, Macy talks about her. She says Macy's happy this year. A pause. That she's different than last year, more settled. Aurora didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I'm glad. Adayeze nodded once, slowly. Come to the cooperative meeting. We'll hear what you have to say. Time. The 3 weeks between those conversations and the cooperative meeting moved the way time moves when you're watching something develop, alternately too fast and too slow. Cross's pressure didn't stop. The credit line review came back with a reduction, smaller than the worst-case scenario, but real. The available limit dropped by 30%. Landon spent a week restructuring his ordering cycles to account for the tighter liquidity, which was tedious and detailed work that he did in the evenings at the kitchen table while Macy did homework across from him. And it was one of those evenings, both of them bent over their separate papers in the lamplight, the apartment quiet, that he understood something he hadn't had words for before. This was what he was protecting. Not the credit line, not the inventory or the margins or the lease terms. This, the lamp, the table. The girl across from him who was writing spelling words with the focused concentration of someone who intended to beat Owen at the relay this time. The knowledge that Aurora would call at 8 and they would talk for half an hour about nothing urgent, and that would be the end of a hard day made bearable. This was the thing that Damian Cross, for all his resources and patience and strategic intelligence, did not understand. Because you couldn't see it on a balance sheet. You couldn't find it in a property assessment or a credit report. It existed in a register that financial analysis didn't reach. Landon thought about his father in the chair in the back room, about what lasted. He went back to the ordering cycle and finished the restructuring before 10. The cooperative meeting was on a Wednesday evening in the first week of June, held in the community room of the Millhaven Public Library, which was where the cooperative had always met because the library let them use the space for free, and because Pete Novak had once argued that if you were going to talk about the future of a neighborhood, you should do it somewhere with books, and nobody had pushed back on this. 11 business owners showed up. Not just the Carver Street tenants. Word had spread, the way word spread in Millhaven, which was quickly and without coordination, through the specific telephone of people who talked to each other over the course of ordinary days. The hardware store's neighbor, a small tax preparation office, sent its owner. The dry cleaner from the next block over came, because his lease was also under a Sterling Holdings subsidiary, and he'd put it together after Pete had mentioned something to someone. 2 owners from this commercial strip on Hadley Avenue came out of interest or solidarity, or the particular civic instinct of small business owners who understood that what happened to one block could happen to theirs. Landon sat in the second row. Aurora sat next to him, which was the first time she'd sat next to him in a public setting where the nature of their relationship was visible and the nature of her professional relationship to the room was also visible, and he could feel both of those things occupying the same space and deciding to coexist. She stood when it was her turn. She told them who she was. The holdings, the structure. Carver Street specifically. She was precise and unapologetic and didn't minimize the strangeness of the fact that she'd been present in their community for 2 years without fully disclosing this. And she said directly that she understood if that created distrust and that she wasn't going to try to talk them out of that distrust. She was going to offer something concrete instead. She laid out the lease terms. 5 years, fixed, below the current market rate in 2 cases and at rate in the others, with a clause that capped any increase at the end of the term at a defined percentage regardless of market conditions. She put the documents on the table in front of her and told them all to have their lawyers or accountants or whoever they trusted look at them. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus Okafor said, "What do you get out of this?" "Stability," Aurora said, "a block that stays what it is, which is worth more to me as a long-term position than the short-term return of selling to Cross Capital." "That's a business answer," Marcus said. "What's the real answer?" Aurora paused. "My daughter." She stopped, looked at Landon briefly, then back at the room. "The man next to me has a daughter who's in school with some of your kids. She's part of this town. I'm part of this town. I have been for 2 years, whether or not I was straightforward about my role in it." She paused. "I'm trying to correct that now. That's the real answer." Another silence, the kind where people were deciding. Pete Novak said from the back row, "I've had the lease paperwork for 2 weeks. My son reviewed it. It's clean." He said this without ceremony. "I signed mine." Carmen Reyes raised her hand slightly. "I signed mine last week." The dry cleaner from the next block said, "How do we know Cross doesn't come back with something worse after the 5 years?" "You don't," Aurora said, "but you'll have 5 years to establish exactly what this block is and why it's worth keeping. That's a stronger position than you're in right now, with month-to-month uncertainty and a man actively trying to create conditions for you to fail." The dry cleaner nodded slowly. He didn't commit, but the nod had weight. What? Damian Cross found out about the cooperative meeting the way men like Cross found out about things, which was efficiently and from multiple directions at once. By Thursday morning, he knew who had attended, what had been offered, and approximately how many signatures Aurora had collected. By Thursday afternoon, he adjusted. He called Landon. Landon almost didn't answer, then decided that not answering was a choice he'd have to explain to himself. So he picked up. "Mr. Pierce?" The voice was smooth, unhurried. "I hear the cooperative had a productive meeting." "It did." "Miss Sterling is creative. I'll give her that." A pause. "I want to be clear that my position hasn't changed. The block's longer-term trajectory is what it is. Lease terms can be renegotiated. Signed agreements have legal weight, but they're not permanent." "They're pretty permanent for 5 years," Landon said. 5 years isn't long in development timelines. Another pause. Deliberate. I also want to say, and I mean this genuinely, that I respect what you've built here. I've made that clear from the beginning, but I want you to think about what you're asking yourself to do. 5 more years of this. A slight emphasis on this. The margins, the triage, the constant weight of it. You're 32, you could walk away with capital, start something new, something that doesn't cost you this much. Landon was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. Do you actually think I'm going to sell because you're framing it as being in my interest? Or are you doing this because you've run out of cleaner options? A pause, longer than the others. You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for initially, Cross said. That happens a lot, Landon said. Have a good day, Mr. Cross. He hung up. He stood in the middle of the store for a minute, and then he realized his hands weren't steady, which told him he was more rattled than he'd allowed himself to feel during the call, which was probably the right call to make during the call, and probably fine to feel now that it was over. He went to the back room and sat in his father's chair. The thing Cross had said, 5 more years of this, had landed differently than Cross intended it to, or maybe exactly as he intended it to, because it had landed at all. There was truth in the weight of it, not the part where Landon should sell, but the part where this was hard, and had been hard for a long time, and would continue to be hard. He sat with that for a while. Then Ricky knocked on the doorframe. There's a guy here asking about deck screws. Like a lot of deck screws. How many is a lot? He has a list. Landon stood up. I'll be out. The Harvest Festival was Millhaven's largest annual event, technically a fall tradition, held the last weekend of September, which meant it arrived in the deep end of the summer's resolution. The town square and the surrounding 3 blocks turned over to it, vendor stalls, a stage for local music, the food competition that the bakery had won 4 of the last 7 years and that Marcus Okafor took seriously enough to be funny about it. The strip of Carver Street closest to the square was always closed to traffic for the weekend, which meant Pierce Hardware's front sidewalk became part of the festival's eastern edge, which meant Landon spent the festival essentially hosting whether he intended to or not. He'd been doing this for 4 years. It was one of the fixed points of his year. This year felt different from the others. By late September, 6 of the 11 business owners who'd attended the cooperative meeting had signed Aurora's lease agreements. 2 more were in final discussions with their attorneys. The dry cleaner from Hadley had signed. The tax office next door had signed and then immediately put out a Harvest Festival sign in the window that said "Staying Put" in large letters, which was either a statement of intent or a passive-aggressive message to anyone who'd been watching the block, and possibly both. The credit line review had resolved without further reduction after Aurora had a direct conversation with a regional banking contact that Landon deliberately chose not to know the details of, because he'd decided there were levels of how the sausage was made that he could absorb, and levels that would cause him to have feelings he didn't have the bandwidth for right now. The supplier situation had also shifted. In August, 2 new suppliers had reached out to Pierce Hardware independently, not through Aurora, or at least not through her directly, though he had his suspicions about the information environment that had led them there. One was a regional hardware cooperative he'd heard of but never pursued. The other was a smaller family-owned distributor looking for anchor accounts in the area. Both offered better terms than what he'd been losing when Cross applied pressure to Halverson. He'd signed with both. His ordering cycles stabilized. The late summer contractor orders came in at a volume that pushed September into the black for the first time in 3 years. He was not going to pretend things were fixed. Fixed was not a state available to him in the near term, maybe not in the long term either, because small independent retail was what it was, and the forces working against it were structural and patient. But better was available. Better was real. And better, for Landon Pierce, was the honest word for what he had. The festival opened Saturday morning under a sky that had cooperated. Macy had been preparing for it for 2 weeks, in the specific way she prepared for things she cared about, which involved a great deal of list-making and checking off and remaking the list when the first one got messy. She had plans that included the kettle corn, the ring toss, a particular craft vendor who made things out of reclaimed wood, and the pie-eating contest, in which she intended to compete despite having finished fourth the previous year and having complicated feelings about it ever since. Aurora arrived at 9 with coffee and a look that said she'd also been awake since 6, but wasn't going to make an issue of it. "You ready?" she said. "For the festival or for whatever Cross is going to do today?" She looked at him. "You think he's coming?" "He's been here for 6 months and we're at the public climax of his investment case. Yeah, I think he's coming." She handed him his cup. "Let him come." The morning went the way festival mornings went, gradually, warmly, with increasing noise. By 11 the street was full and the stage had started, and the smell of the food vendors mixed with the cool edge of late September air, and Macy had already eaten kettle corn and complained about the ring toss, and found her friend from school, and disappeared into the crowd with the freedom of a child at a small-town festival where everyone knew her name. Landon stayed mostly near the store, not because he was anxious, or not only because, but because the store's sidewalk had become an informal gathering point, the way it often did, for people who wanted to stop and talk. Roy from down the block, who'd bought drill bits from him every spring for 3 years. A family he'd helped with a kitchen renovation project whose name he could not remember, but whose gratitude he remembered very specifically. The woman had left a card that he still had somewhere in the office drawer. Pete Novak, who came by at noon with his wife and stood with Landon for a while, saying very little and meaning a great deal by it, in the way Pete communicated most things. Carmen from the flower shop came by with one of her arrangements, a fall one with orange and deep red, and set it on the windowsill outside the door without explanation. He thanked her. She waved it off. The Okafor kids ran past. The 2 older ones, teenagers now, their youngest on Marcus's shoulders. And Marcus stopped briefly and said, "Good Saturday." "Good Saturday," Landon said back. It was the lexicon of a community, he was understanding, not grand or eloquent, just specific and repeated and held in common. Cross arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He came with a second man this time, younger, carrying a tablet, the look of someone whose job was to be present and professional and to document whatever needed documenting. Cross himself was dressed the same way he always dressed, the studied effortlessness that had never quite convinced Landon, though today it seemed slightly forced in a way it hadn't before. A man who'd expected a different landscape and found this instead. He made his way through the festival crowd toward the hardware store and found Landon standing at the front of the store with Aurora beside him and Pete Novak 2 feet to his left, which Pete had arranged by simply arriving and standing there. Carmen had drifted over from the flower shop sometime in the previous hour. The Okafors had finished their circuit of the vendor stalls and landed nearby. The tax office woman, Sandra, her name was Sandra, and she'd signed her lease in July and put "staying put" in the window, was standing with her husband eating something on a stick and not specifically not looking at Cross. It wasn't orchestrated. That was the honest version. Nobody had called a formation. People had simply been where they'd been. And when Cross appeared at 2 o'clock, the people who happened to be around the hardware store at that moment were the people who were always around the hardware store in one way or another, which was, as it turned out, a lot of people. Cross stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at the assembled faces. Not all of them aware of who he was, some of them just at the festival, eating and talking. And Landon watched him understand the geometry of the situation, which was that he was on the outside of something that had been built over years, with materials he didn't carry, and that this was not a negotiable fact. He looked at Landon, then at Aurora. "I came to see how the festival looked," he said, in the tone of a man who had not come to see how the festival looked. "It looks good," Landon said. "You should try the bakery's bread. It won the food competition 2 years running." A pause. Cross looked at Aurora. "You're committed to this." "I was committed to this before you arrived," she said. "Nothing about your presence here changes that." He looked around the group, at Pete, who was looking back with the patient, unhurried gaze of a man who had been here for 31 years. At Carmen, who had her arms crossed and was not bothering to look welcoming. At Marcus Okafor, who was watching Cross with the calm attentiveness of a man who had 3 children and a business and was not interested in being intimidated by a man in an expensive jacket. "You've built something here," Cross said, finally, to Landon specifically. It was the first time he'd said anything to him that sounded unscripted. I mean that as an observation, not a compliment. Okay, Landon said. Cross looked at the store, at the sign, Pierce Hardware. Dan, 1987. He stood there for a moment in a way that suggested he was revising something internally, running new numbers against a model that wasn't producing the expected outputs. Then he said to no one in particular, the 5-year horizon was always a variable. He turned and walked back into the festival crowd, his assistant 3 steps behind him. The people around Landon were quiet for a moment. Then Pete said, "That's it?" "I think so," Landon said. Pete turned back toward the festival. "I'm going to get a piece of that pie." Carmen drifted back toward her stall. The Okafors moved toward the stage, where the afternoon's music was starting. Sandra from the tax office said something to her husband that made him laugh. Aurora was quiet beside him. He looked at her. "Is it over?" he said. "For now." She met his gaze. "He'll reassess. Adjust. Men like Cross don't stop because of one setback. But the block is different now than it was 6 months ago. We're harder to move." "We're harder to move," he said, noting the word. She looked at him without apology. "We." Macy appeared from the direction of the ring toss, slightly flushed, carrying a small stuffed animal that she definitely hadn't won because she had terrible aim at the ring toss, which meant someone had either given it to her or she'd bought it and was claiming to have won it. Either was plausible. "I won," she announced. "You won," Landon agreed without inflection. She handed the stuffed animal to Aurora. "Here, I won it for you." Aurora looked at the animal, which was a small turtle of uncertain species. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Macy looked at the street, the vendors, the crowd, and then at the two of them in the way she had of looking at things she'd already decided were correct. "This is a good day," she said. "Yeah," Landon said. "It is." She ran back into the crowd. He and Aurora stood at the edge of the store and watched the festival move around them. The noise of it, the particular warmth of a community that knew itself, the smell of the kettle corn and the bakery and the late September air, and Landon felt something that he hadn't let himself feel in a long time, which was the uncomplicated present tense weight of being exactly where he was. Not thinking about the credit line or the ordering cycles or the next thing that would go wrong, because there would always be a next thing and he'd handle it. Not thinking about 5 years from now or 2 years ago, just here, in front of his father's store, on a good Saturday, with the people who had turned out to be his people. The stage music started. Something local, a little rough, somebody's kid on guitar working through the chords, and the festival went on, and the afternoon stretched long and gold into the early evening, and the broken bell above the door of Pierce Hardware caught the last of it, and didn't care that it was broken. Some things didn't need to be perfect to matter. Damian Cross left Millhaven on a Thursday in early October, which Landon learned not from Cross himself, but from the particular way a town absorbs an absence. Someone mentioned it at the hardware store, a contractor named Dell, who heard it from someone at the title company who'd been watching the cross-capital activity on the regional property listings. The listings had gone quiet. The preliminary filings Cross had made with the county planning office regarding the Carver Street corridor had been withdrawn without explanation. His name disappeared from the regional business calendar the way names do when men of his type cut their losses, cleanly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement that there had been a campaign at all. Landon heard this information on a Wednesday. He was sorting a delivery at the back counter. He said okay, and went back to the delivery. Ricky, who'd been hovering nearby with the expectant energy of a young man waiting for the reaction, said, "That's it? Just okay?" "What else would I say?" "I don't know. Something. He basically tried to destroy the store." Landon set a box of lag bolts in the right bin. "And he didn't. So okay seems right." Ricky thought about this for a moment. "You're kind of weird about stuff." "Probably," Landon agreed. He told Aurora that evening. She was at the kitchen table going through something on her laptop when he brought it up, and she closed the laptop and was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was processing something she'd been half expecting and still needed a minute to land. "He found a cleaner exit point," she said. "What does that mean?" It means he looked at the block and the signed leases and the community buy-in and recalculated the timeline. The return on continued pressure wasn't worth the spend. She looked at him evenly. It's not sentiment. It's math. He moved the resources somewhere more tractable. So we're just not a good investment anymore. Correct. Landon thought about that for a moment. I'm not sure if that's satisfying or annoying. It doesn't have to be either, she said. It just has to be done. He sat down across from her. The kitchen was quiet. Macy was in bed, early, because she'd had a long day at school that had involved an incident with Owen and the spelling relay that she'd described in exhaustive detail at dinner, and that seemed to have resolved in her favor this time, or at least in a draw, which she was treating as a victory. The apartment had the particular quality it had on the evenings that were just the two of them, after Macy was down. A different texture of quiet, one that Landon had come to understand as its own specific kind of good. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About the last year. He put his elbows on the table. About 2 years ago, actually. About all of it. She waited. I spent 4 years telling myself I was protecting Macy by not wanting things, he said. By keeping everything contained, not risking anything I couldn't afford to lose. He looked at the table. But what I was actually doing was raising her in a house where her father had quietly given up. And I didn't see it that way. I thought I was being responsible. I thought I was being the adult. You were keeping everything from collapsing. Yeah, but there's a version of that where the thing you're keeping from collapsing is just a very controlled form of not living. He looked up. She knew it. She's 8 years old, and she knew something was missing before I did. Aurora was quiet, watching him. The drawing, he said. The one she left on the table. The 3 people in front of the store. I remember. She drew it in March when everything with Cross was starting and I was back to managing everything alone in my head. And she wasn't trying to say anything specific. She's 8. She was just drawing what she saw. He paused. But what she saw was the 3 of us, together, in front of the store. That was her picture of how things were supposed to be. Aurora looked at him carefully. What are you saying? He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who had speeches ready. He was not built for speeches. Never had been, which had been a problem with Denise, who'd wanted more words than he had, more articulation of feeling than he'd known how to produce. He'd gotten better at it over the last year, at Aurora's patient insistence that he say things out loud, even when the saying was imperfect. But he still wasn't eloquent. He was just a man at a kitchen table with 2 cold cups of coffee and a child asleep upstairs who had figured out the shape of her family before her father had. I'm saying I don't want to keep doing this the way we're doing it, he said. She didn't say anything. I'm not asking because everything is resolved. The store's going to have hard months. There are going to be things that break and things that cost money I don't have yet, and things that are just the ongoing fact of the life I've got. He held her gaze. But I want you in it. Not as a morning visit, not as twice-a-week dinners. I want you here. Here as in, here, permanently. He paused. Marry me. The words sat between them on the kitchen table like something solid, not elegant. He hadn't planned the moment, hadn't thought about the setting or whether he should have a ring, which he didn't have, which was the kind of detail he was probably going to feel embarrassed about tomorrow. He just said it because it was true, and the truth had gotten tired of waiting. Aurora looked at him for a long time. Her jaw worked slightly, the way it did when she was holding something in. He'd learned to read that. He watched her eyes change. The controlled composure she wore like a second coat giving way, in layers, to something underneath it that was less composed and more real, and much harder to look at directly because of how much it meant. You don't have a ring, she said. I know. You didn't plan this. No. You just... She stopped, looked at the table, then back at him. You just said it. Yeah. She laughed. It came out slightly broken, which was not how Aurora Sterling laughed, which was how Landon knew it was the real version. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second, and her eyes were bright, and she said, yes, before she fully had control of her voice, so it came out with a crack in the middle of it that she didn't try to fix. Yeah? He said. Yes. More steadily this time. Obviously, yes. He exhaled. He hadn't known he'd been holding his breath, but he had been, which told him something about the distance between deciding to ask and actually asking. He reached across the table and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, not saying much. The apartment was quiet around them, and Macy was asleep down the hall, and outside the October wind was doing what October wind did, which was move through the trees on Carver Street with the particular cold edge that meant the season was turning again, that the long cycle of things was going on without asking anyone's permission. "I'm going to get you a ring," he said. "You don't have to." "I want to." He looked at her hand. "I'm going to pick it myself. It might take me a while to find the right one." "Okay. And I'm going to need you not to have opinions about it beforehand." She looked at him. "I have opinions about everything." "I know. Keep them to yourself until after." She smiled. The real one, the one that was slightly asymmetric and took a half-second to arrive, the one he'd spent 2 years not looking at closely enough and had spent the last year learning to look at. "Okay," she said. "I'll try." He told Macy the next morning. He'd considered waiting, thinking about whether there was a right way to do it, a right moment, some parenting strategy he'd read about or should have read about. He'd thought about it for approximately 12 hours, and then decided that overthinking the delivery was its own form of disrespect to a child who had been clear about what she wanted since March at the very latest. So he told her at breakfast, while she was eating cereal and reading a library book propped against the milk carton, which was a habit he'd given up trying to stop. "Aurora and I are getting married," he said. Macy looked up from the book. She looked at him in the assessing way she had, the way that still occasionally reminded him of his father. "When?" she said. "We haven't figured that out yet." "Can I be in it?" "Yes." "Can I pick my dress?" He thought about this. "Within reason." "What does that mean?" "It means within reason." Oh, she went back to her book for a moment. Then, without looking up, "I knew you were going to." "How did you know?" "Because you look at her like she's the most important thing in the room." She turned a page. "Even when you're pretending to look at something else." He sat with that for a moment. "Eat your cereal," he said. She ate her cereal. They told Aurora's parents over a video call that weekend, which was logistically complex because her parents lived in different cities, and the call involved 2 separate windows and a 15-minute delay while one of them figured out how to unmute, and Aurora sat next to Landon on the couch with the particular expression of a daughter who loves her parents and is deeply familiar with their technical limitations. Her mother cried immediately and happily. Her father asked Landon 3 questions in quick succession about the hardware store, not as an interrogation, but out of the specific curiosity of a man who had worked with his hands and understood that kind of business. And by the end of the call, they were talking about the storeroom flooring repair, which Landon's father-in-law-to-be had opinions about. Landon called his own mother afterward. She was in Asheville now, had been since his father died. She'd needed to be somewhere different, and he'd understood, even when it was hard. She answered on the first ring, and he could hear that she'd been expecting something when she heard his voice, the way mothers sometimes knew things before they were said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have liked her." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too. He would have asked her about the business stuff. He always liked people who understood numbers." "She understands numbers." "I know. You've told me about her." A pause, and in the pause he could hear her smiling. "Not enough, but some." "I'll do better." "Bring her to Asheville," his mother said. "Bring Macy. Come before the spring, when it's still quiet." "We will." He hung up and sat for a minute in the office at the back of the store, his father's chair, his father's work table, the accumulated texture of a space that had held 35 years of one family's work and was now going to hold more. He thought about his father, about Gerald Pierce, who had sat in this chair on hard days and had believed, clearly and without drama, that the people who knew you were the thing that lasted. He'd been right. He'd been right about most things, actually, and Landon had spent 4 years being too far down in his own grief to understand that the things his father had built, not just the store was wood, an inventory, and a lease, The store could be replaced. But the other things, the relationships, the reputation, the fact that Pete Novak had shown up at a cooperative meeting and said I signed mine without being asked, the fact that Carmen had put flowers on the windowsill without explanation, those things had been here all along, waiting for him to see them. He'd been slow to see them. He could live with that. The ring took him 6 weeks to find. He went to 3 jewelers. At the first one, he felt immediately out of his depth and left without buying anything. At the second one, the salesperson was aggressively helpful in a way that made the experience worse. The third place was a small shop 2 towns over that he'd heard about from Dell, the contractor, who'd bought his wife's ring there and whose wife still wore it 20 years later, which Landon felt was a reasonable endorsement. The woman who ran it was in her 60s, patient and unhurried, and she let him look without pressure and answered his questions directly. And when he described what he was looking for, which was imprecise and emotional and not especially useful as a specifications document, she listened to all of it and then showed him 4 options and said, "One of these is right. You'll know." He knew on the third one. He couldn't have articulated why. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't large. It was a simple oval stone set in a low, clean band, and it looked like something built to last, which was the only metric he'd actually had this whole time without knowing how to say it. He bought it and carried it home in his jacket pocket and didn't tell anyone, which was harder than he expected because Macy had developed an interest in the timeline and was checking in on the ring situation approximately every 4 days. He gave it to her on a Sunday morning. Not dramatically, not with a prepared moment. She was at the counter with her coffee, the same counter, the same stool, the same 7:15 becoming later on Sundays routine that was the fixed rhythm of his life. And he came around from behind the counter and stood in front of her the way he'd stood 2 years ago when he hadn't been able to find the words. And this time he had something better than words, which was the small box, which he put on the counter in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "I told you I'd find the right one," he said. She opened the box. She looked at it for a long time. "Landon," she said, "I picked it myself. You can't have opinions about it until—" "It's perfect," she said. Her voice had the crack in it again. "You're not supposed to—" "I'm allowed to say it's perfect." She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, and she wasn't going to cry. She was Aurora Sterling, and she didn't cry easily, but she was close to it, and he was familiar enough with the close version to know what it meant. "It is, though." He slid it onto her finger. It fit, which felt like more than it probably was, and also exactly as much as it was. "Okay," she said after a moment. "Okay," he said. From the office doorway, Macy said, "Did you do the ring?" They both looked at her. "Macy," Landon said, "how long have you been standing there?" "Since the box part." She came forward and looked at Aurora's hand. "It's nice. I like that it's not too big." "But thank you," Aurora said. "Can we get breakfast now? I've been waiting for like 20 minutes. They got breakfast. They were married this following April, on a Saturday, at the Millhaven Community Hall, which was not a grand venue and had a heating system that ran loud and a drop ceiling that nobody loved, but which held everyone they wanted to hold and smelled, faintly, of every event that had ever been held there, which was something. Carmen Reyes did the flowers because Carmen had insisted on it with the specific energy of a person who knows their contribution is load-bearing and intends to be. The Alcafors brought bread and 3 covered dishes. Pete Novak wore a suit that looked like he'd last worn it at his own wedding, which he freely acknowledged with the unself-conscious dignity of a man who owned 2 things in the world that fit: his shop and his marriage. Landon's mother came from Asheville. She wore a blue dress and held Macy's hand during the ceremony and cried at a volume that she had perhaps not fully anticipated, which Macy noted in a whispered aside to Aurora that Aurora spent the rest of the ceremony trying not to visibly react to. Ricky was there, wearing a jacket that was slightly too large in the shoulders and a tie that he'd clearly looked up how to knot on the internet. He gave a toast that was 3 minutes longer than it needed to be, and that included the phrase, "The guy taught me everything I know about bolt organization," and that Landon found, unexpectedly, genuinely moving. Aurora's parents were there. Her father shook Landon's hand at the reception with the grip of a man who had been a laborer and whose hand still remembered it, and said, She's stubborn, you know. I know, Landon said. Don't let her manage everything alone. She'll try. Working on it. Her father nodded with the same nod Aurora had, the one that meant the thing had been received and understood, and didn't need elaborating. It was clearly genetic. Macy wore the dress she'd picked, which was not within anyone's reasonable definition of within reason, being a deep purple with more tulle than a single child needed, and she looked completely, wholly satisfied with herself in it. She was the flower girl, and she took the responsibility seriously enough that she'd practiced the petal distribution pattern the previous weekend in the backyard using cut paper, which was the kind of preparation that Landon recognized as coming directly from him, and that he was not sure whether to be proud of or concerned about. During the ceremony, Landon had one moment that caught him sideways. Not at the vows, he'd been ready for the vows, but just before, when he was standing at the front of the room and Aurora was coming toward him down the aisle. Unhurried, no grand entrance music, just walking the way she walked every morning into the hardware store, like she was coming to a place she already knew. And he saw Macy standing to the side watching her come with an expression that was so purely, uncomplicated happy that it broke something open in him that he hadn't known was still closed. 4 years ago, he'd been in his father's chair on a bad night telling himself that wanting things was a liability, that love was a luxury item, that he had Macy and the store and enough was what you settled for when the math didn't work. He'd been wrong about the math. The math, it turned out, included things that didn't show up in any ledger he'd been keeping. It included a broken bell that still rang badly every time someone came through the door. It included a stool on the customer side of a counter that had become someone's stool through the patient accumulation of mornings. It included a child who could spell metamorphosis and who understood, at 8 years old, that people changed into something different, into something more. He'd been slow to change. He'd needed the time. And the woman walking toward him now had given him the time and waited and come back and stood beside him when the trouble came and made the calls and showed up every morning. Not because she needed him to be anything other than what he was, but because what he was apparently was enough. More than enough. Aurora reached him. She stopped, close. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that December morning 2 years ago when she'd said the words out loud for the first time, except without the fear behind it. Just the truth, clean and direct and like everything she said. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. The officiant cleared his throat gently. They got married. The things that changed and the things that didn't were both worth naming. The apartment above the store became a full home, the kind of home that accumulates the specific evidence of 3 people living in it. Macy's books in every room, Aurora's reading glasses on the kitchen table alongside Landon's tools catalogs, a collection of mismatched mugs that reflected 3 different people's preferences and that nobody had rationalized into a set. It was a small space. It was full in the right ways. Aurora didn't give up her work. Sterling Holdings continued operating, the holdings continued existing, and the specific demands of managing a portfolio of regional businesses didn't stop because she'd gotten married. Because, of course, they didn't. She worked hard. She had weeks where she was difficult to reach and weeks where the difficulty of what she was managing showed up in how she came home at the end of the day, tired in a bone-deep way that Landon had learned to recognize, and to meet with dinner on the stove and nothing said until she was ready to say it. He wasn't perfect at this. Sometimes he asked before she was ready. Sometimes he got it right. Pierce Hardware didn't transform. It didn't suddenly thrive in some newly unlocked mode. The margins stayed what margins stayed. The triage continued. There was always something needing triage. And the economic pressures on independent hardware retail were structural and not resolved by any personal development in the life of its owner. What changed was that the store's community anchoring became something visible and deliberate rather than something Landon had maintained quietly by the sheer inertia of keeping the doors open. The signed leases along the block, the cooperative that now met monthly instead of quarterly, the informal network of small business owners who'd been pulled into each other's awareness by the cross-capital situation. These things gave the store a context it hadn't had before. Not protection exactly, just not alone. The credit line recovered to its full amount over 8 months of consistent performance and a renewed relationship with the bank contact that Landon managed himself without Aurora's involvement, which was something that mattered to him and that she respected without needing it, explained. Macy turned 9, then 10. She remained a formidable speller. She read everything. She had, by 11, developed opinions about architecture, specifically about the hardware store's layout, which she'd presented in a handwritten document with diagrams that she left on the kitchen table one Saturday morning, and that Landon had read 3 times because it was genuinely thoughtful. He didn't implement all of her suggestions. He implemented 2 of them. She tracked which ones he'd used and was satisfied with this, in the way she was satisfied with partial victories, which was to say she filed them away for later. She called Aurora Mom for the first time on a Tuesday in October of the year she turned 10. Not with announcement or wait. Just in passing, in the middle of asking something about dinner, the words slipping into ordinary speech like it had always been there and had simply been waiting for the right sentence. Aurora had gone still for a moment, very briefly, and then continued answering the dinner question in a voice that was completely level except for the very last word, which was slightly unsteady, which only Landon heard because he was close enough to hear it. That evening, after Macy was in bed, Aurora sat in the kitchen and didn't say anything for a while. Landon made tea he wasn't going to drink and set it in front of her and sat down. "You okay?" he said. "Yes." She looked at the mug. "I didn't know it would—" She stopped. "I know. I had a plan for how I'd feel about it. Turns out the plan wasn't accurate. Feelings tend to do that." She looked at him. "When did you get wise?" "Slow learner," he said. "Takes a while." She put her hand over his on the table. They sat there in the quiet of the kitchen, in the particular late October silence of a house that had 3 people in it and was big enough for all of them. And the tea cooled, and outside on Carver Street the wind moved through the trees, and the hardware store below them was dark and locked and was going to open again tomorrow morning at 7. Quote, "There is a version of this story that ends with everything resolved, every wound healed, every hard thing having taught its lesson cleanly and completely. That version isn't quite honest. What's honest is this: Landon Pierce was 32 when he started paying attention to his own life again. He'd spent 4 years underwater, managing, surviving, telling himself that the reduced version of things was the responsible version. He was wrong, and the specific shape of his wrongness, the protective withdrawal, the pride dressed up as self-sufficiency, the fear wearing the costume of practicality, cost him time he can't get back and connection he had to rebuild slowly, in the awkward, incremental way that real rebuilding works. The woman who waited for him to catch up was not a saint. She was a person who'd built extraordinary things in the world and had still managed to be lonely in the particular way that capable, private people are lonely. Not for lack of ability to be in a room with people, but for lack of anyone seeing past the capability to the person inside it. She'd found that person seen across a worn wooden counter in a hardware store she happened to own and had chosen, for her own complicated reasons, not to tell him about. That choice cost her something too. There are no free passes in that story. What they built together was real, not because it was perfect, but because it was made of the actual materials of their lives. The store with its unromantic margins, the child with her opinions and her purple dress and her slow developing understanding that family was a word that could expand without losing its meaning, the community that had shown up not out of sentiment but out of the accumulated weight of 30 years of Gerald Pierce and his son being present and useful and consistent in one place. Landon thinks about his father a lot, not with the suffocating grief of the first years, but with the ordinary presence of a man who left things behind that outlasted him. The chair in the back room, the system for the bolt inventory, the name on the sign, and the thing he said once, to nobody in particular, that a 12-year-old boy stored away and didn't understand until he was 32. The people who know you. That's the only thing that actually lasts. He was right. And one more thing, small and specific, that matters more than it probably should. He fixed the bell. Not immediately after Aurora moved in, not right after the wedding, not on any occasion that would make the timing feel meaningful. He fixed it on a random Thursday in November, 2 years after the marriage, while doing a list of small maintenance jobs he'd been putting off. He replaced the mechanism, adjusted the mounting, and tested it 3 times. It worked. It rang properly. A clean, clear sound, the kind of sound a bell above a door is supposed to make. The following morning at 7:15, Aurora pushed through the door with 2 coffees, the way she had pushed through that door, in one form or another, for 4 years. The bell rang. She stopped, looked up at it, looked at him. "You fixed it," she said. "Told you I would." "You said that in December." She set the coffees on the counter. 3 years ago. "I had some things to do first." But she gave him the look, the one that was exasperated and warm and completely unwilling to pretend it wasn't both. Then she sat down on her stool, which was her stool, which had always been her stool, and picked up her coffee. Macy blew in at 7:40 with the energy of a child who had decided the morning needed more of her in it. She shed her backpack. She took 2 steps toward the counter and then stopped and looked up. "The bell sounds different," she said. "Fixed it," Landon said. She considered this. "It took you a long time." It did. She thought about it for another moment, with the philosophical patience of a 10-year-old who had more or less figured out that her father did things in his own time and that his own time was longer than most people's. "Better late than never," she said, and grabbed her book from her backpack and went into the office. Aurora looked at Landon. The morning light was doing what morning light did when it came through the east window of Pierce Hardware, catching the dust in the air, landing on the worn wood of the counter, making ordinary things look for a moment like they were worth keeping. Which they were. They always had been. He just needed to be brave enough to notice.